Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the June Pacific Northwest Drought Early Warning System Drought and Climate Outlook webinar. Thank you to those that have joined us previously and to those joining us for the first time. My name is Megan Dalton, and I'm with the Pacific Northwest Climate Impacts Research Consortium, or CIRC. This bi-monthly webinar series is hosted by NIDIS, CIRC, and the Northwest Climate Hub. It's designed to provide stakeholders in the Pacific Northwest with timely drought and climate information. Each webinar is tailored to reflect recent, current, and forecasted conditions and climatic events, and also includes discussions of observed impacts and other relevant updates from across the region. A recording of this webinar will be posted on drought.gov later this week. PDFs of the presentations can be accessed by emailing Britt Parker, the Pacific Northwest DEWS coordinator, after the webinar. And after today's webinar, you'll have the opportunity to provide us feedback that will help us improve the series. So please take a moment and tell us what you think. So today's speakers include John Abatsoglu, a CIRC researcher at the University of Idaho, who will present the climate recap and current conditions. Then Troy Lindquist with the National Weather Service Boise Weather Forecast Office will present the climate outlook. And next we have Chris Conrad with USGS, who will speak about water resources vulnerability to drought in the Pacific Northwest. And finally, Brooke Penaluna with the U.S. Forest Service will present research on aquatic-riparian ecosystem management. During the webinar, please use the chat box to ask questions during the presentations, and we will address them during the question and answer period after all the presenters have finished. So before we move into the presentations, we'll briefly highlight the partners that make this webinar happen. The Pacific Northwest Climate Impact Research Consortium, or CIRC, is a climate science to climate action team funded by NOAA's Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessment Program. CIRC supports communities, policymakers, and resource managers in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Western Montana as they work to adapt to the changing climate. Next slide. The Northwest Climate Hub develops and delivers science-based region-specific technologies and practical information to assist agricultural and natural resource managers with climate-informed decision-making. And then to highlight NIDIS, I'll turn it over to Holly Prendeville with the USDA Northwest Climate Hub, who is covering today for Britt Parker.
Thank you, Megan. Britt is the Regional Drought Information Coordinator for the Pacific Northwest and Missouri River Basin, and she is with NOAA's National Integrated Drought Information System. NIDIS's mission is to improve the nation's capacity to proactively manage drought-related risks by providing those affected with the best available information and resources to assess the potential for drought and to better prepare for, mitigate, and respond to the effects of drought. We want to improve our understanding of how and why drought affects society, the economy, and the environment, and to improve accessibility, dissemination, and use of early warning information for drought risk management. NIDIS's approach to achieve that goal is to build the foundation of the national DEWS through the development of regional DEWS, where networks, partners, and stakeholders share information and actions that help communities cope with drought. The ultimate goal of the National Early Warning System, we recognize the impacts and early warning information differ across the region, so each DEWS has many of the same base ingredients, but ultimately have their own flavor to reflect the needs of the region. The PNW DEWS was officially launched in February 2016, and our strategic plan is available on drought.gov. This roadmap for moving forward with the PNW DEWS identifies existing and new drought-related activities in the region with priority areas that include improving monitoring and research for drought risk management, expanding drought early warning communications and outreach, optimizing information in collaborative networks, and enhancing drought planning and mitigation. Next slide, please. Mark your calendars for our next webinar on the PNW DEWS Drought and Climate Outlook webinar series. It is the 26th of August. Also, mark your calendars for the annual meeting. It will be held in conjunction with the Northwest Climate Conference the week of October 7th in Portland, Oregon. Please stay tuned for details. Next slide, please. To facilitate our early warning system, more precipitation observations are needed. We encourage you to join COCORAS, the Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. This is a unique nonprofit community-based network of volunteers of all ages and backgrounds, working together to measure and map precipitation, that is rain, hail, and snow, as well as condition reporting. Observations by COPEROS observers of precipitation events and the lack of precipitation are important events to capture and improve our understanding of weather. Next slide, please. To become a COPEROS volunteer, you can go to their website here or contact your state coordinator. I will put in all of the state coordinators' email addresses into the chat box for your use. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Holly. So next we'll turn it over to John Abatsaglu for the climate recap.
Okay, so my task here is to give you a little bit of the play-by-play in terms of what's transpired this spring and over the first few weeks of climatological summer, and basically what's led us to these drought monitor maps that depict that we actually do have a bit of drought across the Northwest. And you can see them. This is the map on the right, depicts the conditions as of last Thursday, and just to compare that to where we were this time last year, last year's map is on the left. And so you can see that we do have some color of drought across about a third of the Northwest, primarily across western Washington, northwestern Oregon, and then the northern part of the domain up into northeastern Washington, the Idaho Panhandle, and western Montana. And what's actually really interesting is that if you look at the lower 48 as a whole, we're exceptionally void of drought. Only about 4% of the land and 13 million people are being affected by drought as depicted by these maps. But it turns out that about half of that area and half of the population is here in the Northwest. So that actually makes our discussion here of the current conditions of drought somewhat interesting in the Northwest. I don't know what this looks like in other geographic areas. So let's move on and talk about how we got here. So this first map is showing us precipitation current water year to date. So this is from October 1st up until yesterday, and these maps are updated every day at the Northwest Climate Toolbox. And what we're looking at here are percentiles. So we're basically looking at percentiles of this period relative to the previous 40 years. And what we can see is certainly we have areas of below normal to much below normal precipitation, basically from the Cascade Crest to the Pacific, across northern Oregon and western Washington. And it's kind of interesting if you looked at that previous figure and you look at this figure, you'd almost see that they'd actually match each other to a T in terms of the areas depicted in drought by the U.S. Drought Monitor and the areas of below normal precipitation shown here. Now that's probably not too much of a surprise. What's also interesting is if you look at this map, you know anything about sort of the distribution of precipitation across the Northwest, and I were to draw two lines for you, one line was basically the ISO line of areas that receive more than 30 inches of precipitation a year, and areas that receive less than 15 inches of precipitation a year. You'd find that quite a bit of the areas of the Northwest that are wet, climatologically wet, are in some form of drought now. By contrast, portions of the Northwest that are climatologically dry have actually seen above normal precipitation. And it turns out that this is actually quite reflective of what we typically see during El Niños, where the jet stream dives to the south, reduces sort of the precipitation falling in its preferred locations, reduces orographic uplift, and you end up getting a little bit more sneaky precipitation coming into the drier areas that are typically rain shadowed out. So let's take a look at the last 60 days, and these again the same thing we're looking at. Temperature here shown on the left, precipitation shown on the right. It's been warm and dry. And there are a few exceptions. Certainly you see this sort of east-west gradient in terms of temperature, in the top 10 percentile across much of Washington state and Western Oregon. And in terms of precipitation, it's actually been, rather dry. Again, very much pointing to the same sort of areas from the Cascade Crest to the coast. And then there's a sort of emerging area of sort of below normal precipitation, at least for the last 60 days across sort of the Colville National Forest, Idaho Panhandle up into western Montana, and then in the sort of the Selway Bitterroots into southwestern Montana as well, below normal precipitation. Now, what's actually interesting is, so we've been hearing a lot of stories about how wet it's been in the United States, and it certainly is extremely wet. We have a bit of a drought here in the Northwest, and it turns out that drought does not stop at the 49th parallel. And this is showing us a map of land surface temperature anomalies from the MODIS satellite. And so land surface temperature anomalies are depicting two things. They're depicting sort of the surface temperature. That's sort of an indication of air temperature, but it's also an indication of surface moisture availability. So where you see the well above normal surface temperatures, that's reflecting some combination of warmer than normal conditions plus drier than normal conditions. And the point here being is that we have this huge swath of area here from southeastern Alaska across British Columbia, Alberta, extending down to the northwestern United States. So this is part of the drought pattern that we're seeing. And it just so happens that, sort of northwestern, sort of southeastern Alaska and sort of western Canada is bearing the brunt of it. So a little bit about why this is happening. I'll focus in here on the last, say, 8 to 10 weeks. Climatologically, this time of the year, we typically see precipitation frequently across the Northwest. It tends to peter out pretty quickly right around now as we go into the dry season. But the storm track or the jet stream more or less has a beeline across the Pacific, and basically in the Northwest, sort of the jet exit region exists here. So we get storms that typically come through. So that's climatology. This is what we expect. And let me show you what we actually have received. And so this is the same sort of figure, but it's this year, right? So what you can see if I sort of toggle back and forth is that we actually have seen the jet stream quite strong, and we've got this actually a nice, a bit of an additional trough out here over the Aleutians. And then we have actually the jet stream steering way up to the north, and that has deflected storms from entering into the Northwest, entering into southeastern Alaska, entering into British Columbia. And instead, we've seen a lot more storms making their way into south central Alaska, and also a pretty strong subtropical jet stream that's kept the Southwest pretty wet and cool, and of course brought abundant moisture into the midsection and eastern 2/3 of the United States. And we basically have had this substantial ridge or blocking pattern that's sort of deflected much of the storms across from entering the region. So that's responsible for the dry conditions that we've seen. And I just wanted to walk you through a couple of time series or figures for a couple locations. This is showing accumulated calendar year precipitation for Olympia, Washington. And you can basically see the black here is showing us the data for the calendar year to date. Climatology is shown here in gold, and it's been really dry. And in fact, if you look at the data from March 1st onward, it's basically been the driest period on record for Olympia, Washington. They've had about 5 inches of rain over that time period. And 2 years ago in 2017, they had 20 inches of rain or 21 inches of rain over that same time period. So pretty dry conditions. And then in terms of temperature, we certainly can remember how cold it was back in February and into early March. And this is showing us here temperatures from Portland International Airport. It's not showing us the actual temperatures, it's showing us the temperature departures for each day. And so here is the sort of block persistent cold temperatures, and pretty much, since that time period, it's been more often it's been warmer than normal. And we've had a few cool periods. We had one certainly this past weekend, but we've seen above normal temperatures, and you put below normal precipitation, above normal temperatures together, and you have drought like we've seen across the region. Snow across much of the region is more or less gone, although it did make a little cameo appearance in a few places this last weekend. But just walking us through from the Water Watcher on the Climate Toolbox, These are percentiles of snow water equivalent on March 1st, April 1st, May 1st, and June 1st. And so the April 1st snow water equivalent map actually somewhat resembles what we see during an El Nino, below normal snowpack across the Cascades and the Northern Rockies. So in some ways, we did actually get a pattern here in the Northwest in terms of particularly sort of the spring warm and dry conditions allowing for low snowpack. And of course, we did have a cool start to astronomical summer. Climatological summer started a few weeks ago, but we did have a cold air come through the region and drop some snow across Idaho and Montana. And then just to conclude here, we do have evidence of drought across the Northwest. It's one of the few areas in the lower 48 with drought at the moment. In some ways, this looks a little bit like what we see during an El Nino in terms of the below normal precipitation, above normal temperatures. And what's interesting, I think, is that the drought signatures are most prevalent in the climatologically wet regions. And I'll just allude that, what happens going forward, and Troy will talk more about this, but it really depends on sort of the persistence and placement of the western ridge. So with that, I will stop showing my screen and move on to the next presentation.
All right, thank you so much, John. So we'll go ahead and move on to the climate outlook with Troy Lindquist.
Everybody see my screen okay?
Looks good.
Okay. What we're going to talk about is we'll start off with the ENSO status, or El Nino Southern Oscillation, kind of where that stands and expectations for that. And then we're going to get into our seasonal outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center for temperature and precipitation. And towards the end of the presentation, we'll look at briefly water supply, where that stands, and the drought outlook and significant wildland fire expectations through the summer. So what I'm showing here is the sea surface temperature anomalies over the tropical Pacific area. The warm colors are indicating warmer than normal temperatures, and the blues indicate cooler than normal temperatures. And this is as of June 20th, and I'm going to overlay these various Niño regions on there. And the one I really want to highlight here is that Niño 3.4 region, and that's often referred to as the Niño 3.4 index, and that's used to kind of define and characterize these ENSO events and put them into historical perspective, just to see how they compare to past ENSO events. I also want to point out the NOAA definitions for El Nino. So that would be sea surface temperature anomalies greater than 0.5 degrees Celsius. But we also need a coupling of the atmospheric conditions with those anomalous sea surface temperatures. So we want to see the anomalies in the convection or the clouds and the precipitation over the tropical Pacific Ocean, as well as in the wind fields, coupled with those sea surface temperatures. And in general, we're seeing the those atmospheric conditions coupled with these sea surface temperature anomalies. Thus, we have weak El Nino conditions across the area, and there is an El Nino advisory in effect, and we do expect these to continue through the summertime and the fall, and favored even to continue into the winter. With these charts here, we can see how things have evolved over the last 12 months. The graphs on the right show each of those Niño regions, starting with July of last summer and continuing through June of this year. And you see the Niño 4 and 3.4 regions, the two top graphs. We remain above that 0.5 degrees Celsius anomaly, the temperature anomalies, or the y-axis on the left there. That's got your temperature on those graphs with the months moving forward from left to right along the x-axis on the bottom. But on the Niño 3 and 1 and 2 regions, they've actually cooled to below that 0.5 degrees Celsius. anomaly, but that 3.4 region is the one that we're really watching, that Niño 3.4 index. If we look at the model predictions for ENSO and what we expect to happen, you can see on this graph the Niño 3.4 SST or sea surface temperature anomaly on the y-axis. I've got the El Niño threshold there shaded in the light red or the pink. And you can see from the current conditions in May, we are at that weak El Niño phase. But moving forward, as you go from left to right, those are 3-month chunks of time. So after May, that MJJ at the bottom is May, June, July, and then the next one is June, July, August, and so on. The majority of the models continue to show weak El Niño conditions through the summer and the fall and even into the winter time. So that is what's favored to happen as we move forward in time. And if we look at the probabilistic graph for each of those categories, El Niño, neutral, or La Niña, you can see we're generally around 60% probability in favor of continuing El Niño conditions. Those are the red bars. As we move through time from left to right, again, those are 3-month chunks of time along the bottom, June, July, August at the far left, and then you can see the fall and winter I have highlighted. So around 60% probability that we'll see those El Niño conditions continuing again through the fall and into next winter. So what kind of impacts do we normally see during the summertime when we're in an El Niño phase? As far as temperature and precipitation goes, not much. If you look at this chart, you can see across the entire northern hemisphere, there's very little in general as far as temperature and precipitation impacts go. Most of that's across the southern hemisphere during their winter season. But one thing I do want to point out in this graph is we do see more hurricane activity typically during El Niños across the eastern tropical Pacific, and fewer hurricanes on the Atlantic side. So potentially, if we see more hurricane activity over the eastern tropical Pacific, we could, if the wind fields are favorable, and maybe pull some of that tropical moisture from these hurricanes up across the Great Basin, potentially into parts of the Pacific Northwest, and maybe get some, possibly get a decent amount of thunderstorms or maybe some anomalous precipitation event if that were to happen. So just something to keep an eye on, something of interest I wanted to point out. So let's move on to our outlooks. This is for 8 to 14 day outlook. So July 1 through July 7th at a very early part of July. And as John pointed out, some things we've seen in the jet stream that have kept us, that's kept us kind of cool in general across the region, and kind of waiting for that ridge to build over the Four Corners in the west and bring us some summertime temperatures. It looks like the models are indicating starting about July 1st, 2nd, or 3rd, we are going to see that ridge building across the Four Corners and the Great Basin, and that's going to bring in some summertime heat finally. So the outlook for that 8 to 14 day period pretty strongly favors above normal temperatures across the Pacific Northwest, and a slight lean towards below normal precipitation across the region, as seen with that light brown shading on the right. The monthly outlook for July favors above normal temperatures across the entire Pacific Northwest region, while precipitation for July on the right shows a slight favor for below normal precipitation across Northwest Washington. Then when you get into eastern Idaho, we have a slight lean towards above normal precipitation for the month of July. Our August, September, October seasonal outlook, so late summer into early fall. Again, above normal temperatures favored across the entire Pacific Northwest region. And for precipitation, again, we have a lean towards above normal precipitation for eastern Idaho, with the rest of the Pacific Northwest region in that EC category. That's equal chances of either above normal, below normal, or normal precipitation. And when we go September, October, November, this is the core fall months across the region. Again, above normal temperatures are favored, and that equal chances of either above or below normal or normal precipitation. Moving on to water supply. And if things you'll notice about this, this is April through September runoff volumes at all these forecast points. And we're showing percent of normal, but the colors here, warm colors indicate below normal, and the greens and blues indicate above normal or near normal runoff volumes. But this matches up pretty well with the drought conditions that John showed in his drought monitor map. So what we have here basically is, since most of our area is water volume and runoff is determined by snowpack and spring precipitation, that is in the past. We know what that looks like. So these numbers aren't going to change much moving forward through the rest of the water year. And we get very little of our annual precipitation, through the summertime period. So we'll see very little change in these numbers as we move forward with additional forecasts. But again, northwest Washington, up along the Canadian border into northwest Montana, those areas where the snowpack was poor, had below normal precipitation, that's where you see those lower percentages as far as runoff volumes go. And you get into eastern Oregon, even southeast Washington, across central southern Idaho, where we had the better snowpack and some good spring precipitation. That's where you see some of the highest runoff numbers expected through that period. So overall, most of the region, the water supply outlook looks pretty good. We've had really good to fill most of the major reservoir systems across eastern Oregon, southern Idaho. A little bit bigger picture for the drought monitor. You can see, like John pointed out, across the Pacific Northwest, we've got those drought conditions, northwest Oregon, northwest western Washington, along the Canadian border into northwest Montana. If we look at the seasonal drought outlook, you can see we expect drought to persist in those areas. And there's some expectation for drought development to occur even further south of those areas as we move through the summertime into the very early part of fall. And finally, we'll look at the significant wildland fire potential graphics. And this one is for June. You'll see that the right map there. That was issued at the very first part of June. And you can see across the Pacific Northwest, there was just basically the Cascades West were favored for above normal significant wildland fire potential. The rest of the area was either normal or below normal. And if you look at the current large incidence map on the left, you can see there's just one large incident kind of in central Washington there, but otherwise it's been a really below normal fire season so far across the whole West. And finally, if we look at the July, August, and September wildland fire potential maps, the July in the upper left, you can see, again, the Washington, Oregon Cascades, and then along the Canadian border into northwest Montana. Those areas have above normal. Again, that matches up nicely with areas that are in drought, where we've had that lower snowpack and lesser amounts of precipitation for the water year so far. August, the middle map, same general areas have that above normal temperature, and then September in the lower right, same thing for those areas, above normal potential with pretty much normal for the rest of the Pacific Northwest region. And just to summarize the takeaways, weak El Nino present, And we do expect that to continue through the summer and fall into next winter. Above normal temperatures are favored in the outlooks across the entire Pacific Northwest region through the summer and next fall. Let's see, for precipitation below normal for Northwest Washington in July, and above normal for eastern Idaho through the summer, otherwise equal chances across the area. And we do expect those drought conditions to persist along the Canadian border, western Washington into northwest Oregon, with some expansion to the south. And those drought areas, that's where the significant wildland fire potential is above normal as we move through the summer months. And that is all I've got.
All right, thank you, Troy. Next, we'll turn it to Chris Conrad.
Hi, this is Chris Conrad. I'm going to be giving an overview of a project that we just wrapped up, looking at the vulnerability of rivers, streams, and aquifers in the Northwest. Understanding vulnerability of water resources can help with drought planning and mitigation at this time of year. Water resources managers are wondering where resources can be needed for drought response. So in 2015, USGS initiated an investigation of stream flow responses to the drought across 6 western states. NIDIS extended the analysis to examine drought vulnerability in rivers, specifically larger perennial systems, streams that include non-perennial streams, and groundwater. The map here shows stream flow in rivers as a annual percentile for the summer of 2015. And so you can see that much of the West was experiencing pretty severe drought with annual percentile below 5% in a lot of cases. So we looked at seasonal responses of rivers to the 2015 drought. We looked at 325 gauge rivers that had at least 10 years of daily stream flow record, screened them for reservoir storage, diversions, and land use. So we got relatively natural flows. And if you look at this plot, it shows stream flow as an annual percentile, like in that map. And it has the water years as X's. Open circles are for spring stream flow, and then the gray circles are July to September stream flow. And you can see what really makes 2015 pretty exceptional wasn't the water year hydrologic drought, but it was that spring and summer stream flows were exceptionally low. Oh, sorry about that, I'm going the wrong way. And if you look at across different types of rivers, so this plot here shows 5 different types of rivers. We have snow rain transition, summer rain, autumn winter rain, and winter rain. We look at the seasonal responses of these different types of systems. You can see a lot of variety, and in fact, the snow and the snow rain transitions, we saw a lot of the systems had higher than normal stream flow, which is what's being shown in these boxes. The dashed line represents normal. And if you look at the blue, 2 blue circles, you can see those bottom either at or above the dashed line, indicating higher stream flows in fall and winter in the snow and the snow rain transition. But then moving into spring and summer, you can see all of the different systems at below normal stream flow. And I think this is an important point because there's some perception that the 2015 drought was largely a story of snow drought, but in fact, it was also a story of a very dry spring. So a general framework for drought vulnerability is that vulnerability is equal to sensitivity times exposure, where vulnerability for stream flow would be the deficit during specific drought, like in 2015. Sensitivity is the incremental response of stream flow to precipitation. So how much does the stream flow change for a given change in precip? And then exposure is the precipitation deficit for a particular year. And this kind of gives us a pretty simple normative model where we can look at stream flow during a drought is equal to precipitation during a drought times the normal ratio of stream flow to precipitation. If this model works or is approximately true, then the precipitation elasticity of stream flow is said to be equal to 1. So for every percent change in precipitation, you'll get equivalent percent change in stream flow. Oh, sorry, I'm having a really hard time with control. There we go. So how does this kind of very simple normative model do? There's 2 panels here. The left panel shows water year results, and the right panel shows summer results. And what's being plotted is the ratio of runoff to precipitation for a normal year versus runoff to precipitation for 2015. And the red boxes that are tilted represents rivers where the elasticity is greater than 1. So those are the places where we would expect stream flow if precipitation is, say, 90% of normal. Stream flow is going to be less than 90% of normal. And the further away you get from that the upper edge of that box, the smaller that percentage for stream flow. And it may be a little bit hard to see, but in the left panel, basically on the left side of the left panel are arid basins, and you can see those generally plot below that 1-to-1 line. And so that indicates high sensitivity for water year runoff. If you look at summer 2015 plot on the right, you can see that most sites, kind of regardless of whether they're arid or not, are plotting below that 1-to-1 line. So what we see is that more of the precipitation deficit comes out of stream flow than evapotranspiration in arid basins and during dry season. Okay, on the topic of vulnerability of streams, streams have an added risk of going dry during a drought, so not just having low stream flow, but having no stream flow, and that eliminates surface water availability for social and ecological purposes. USGS developed a model called PROSPER, which is a GIS-based statistical model predicting whether or not a stream will go dry in a given year based on meteorological input and some spacing characteristics. This reference Jaeger et al. 2019 Journal of Hydrology, if you're interested in the results or the methods. But the plot here shows, or the maps here show 3 different basins and what the probabilities of going dry or staying wet are for a dry year and then for a wet year. So you can see this model provides kind of spatially explicit predictions using NHD reach network for different years. For the Pacific Northwest, the model has actually been integrated into StreamStats, so you can see the results for water years 2004 to 2016 on the USGS StreamStats site. The web address is down at the bottom of the screen. It's streamstats.usgs.gov/SSS. Okay, so finally, we talk about groundwater vulnerability. USGS maintains a limited network of groundwater wells to monitor responsive phosphorus to climate. States in this region actually have much more extensive networks, but we started with this network, and we basically wanted to look at some ways of looking at groundwater vulnerability to drought. We applied spectral analysis, which is a time series, statistical time series method to separate the seasonal responses. So there's just the water level fluctuations between winter and summer, essentially, from the responses of extended drought at these climate response wells. The plots here show, on the upper panel, show depth to water level from land surface. So you can kind of see from 2004 up to the present. This well has seen water level fluctuations on the order of about 20 feet. Seasonally, we're seeing about a 5-foot fluctuation. When we apply spectral analysis to this record, we get this plot down here, the lower panel, and it's basically showing dominant frequencies of water level cycles. And so at the 10 cycles per decade, or 1 cycle per year, we're seeing a high amplitude, and that represents seasonal variation. And then we see these strong drought response in 2006 and 2015 that are more along frequency of 1 to 2 per decade. So this is an important analysis. There's additional information, though, that time series analysis would help tease apart, which is the lag from drought, kind of onset of drought or drought conditions. How long does it take the water level system, the groundwater systems to respond to that? And then likewise, how quickly does it come out of drought when it starts raining? So in summary, both snow and rain dominant rivers are vulnerable to the 2015 drought. Stream flow responses to drought are nonlinear and amplify normalized precipitation deficits, especially in arid basins and during dry seasons. So that's where, if we have some precipitation as a percent of normal, deficit, we're going to see stream flow probably as a smaller percent of normal. Prosper, the tool for looking at stream flow permanence, is available online for assessing how drought affects stream flow permanence across stream networks in the Northwest. And then drought vulnerability assessments of groundwater must account for lag, seasonal variation, and cumulative effects of drought. Spectral analysis provides a tool for identifying where responses to prolonged drought are outside the range of precipitation. And that's all I've got. Oh, there's one final slide here too, if there's additional information if you'd like that.
All right, thank you, Chris. We'll
Sure.
turn it over now to our final speaker, Brooke Penaluna.
Thanks, everybody. I'm going to be building on what our previous speakers had talked about and talking about using a framework of natural disturbance regimes and portfolio concepts to help minimize risk in aquatic riparian ecosystems. Climate extremes are becoming more frequent and more intense and are expected to become more common into the future. Climate change, coupled with a legacy of other stressors and emerging stressors, increase the probability that species will experience conditions that do not have a historical analog. As shown here, you see a variety of stressors on our aquatic riparian ecosystems in the Pacific Northwest. And the darker gray bars are when that stressor has been considered the most severe, but you're seeing a legacy of those stressors on the landscape through today. One of the stressors that have been talked about a lot today, one of the climate extremes that's becoming more frequent and intense, is drought. And so how do we manage and think about our aquatic riparian ecosystems as climate extremes such as drought are becoming more frequent? So how can we essentially buffer our ecosystems and their associated species against uncertainty into the future? If we ask that question in the economic sector, they would tell us to minimize our risk by diversifying our investments. So essentially, we should diversify our investment portfolio by investing in a variety of investments. In that case, they would say invest in bonds, currency or cash, real estate, a variety of stocks over different time frames that have different risk, and gold or whatever that might be. Essentially have a diversity within your investment portfolio to be this broad term investment strategy, and by doing so you'll create stability in your investment. So thinking about what that would look like on our across our ecosystems or in ecology, what we see here is that diversity and habitats leads to biological diversity, which leads to stability over time. So if you look at the graph, the figure representation on the top, you see a landscape that is considered more diverse in the habitat types that are represented there in reference compared to the one in the middle or the one at the bottom that are more simplified. And so the more diverse the landscape is, the more diverse habitats that are offered across the landscape, the more biocomplexity that's allowed to be present there, as represented by the different species that could be present across the landscape. And as that landscape simplifies, as you would move down in the figure looking at landscape that becomes more and more simple, you lose different aspects of the biological component that could be present on the landscape. So essentially, looking at that is what's called in ecology now is called the portfolio effect. And the idea behind the portfolio effect is that you minimize risk by diversifying the biological complexity on the landscape. And that could be diversity in life history strategies, age structure, life forms, the different genetic composition that's present, different behaviors. And so one would try to diversify this biocomplexity across the landscape. And we suggest that a way to do that is by allowing natural disturbance regimes to also play out across the landscape. Disturbance initiates change that sustains that variability in habitats and consequently the biological patterns which can occur. So what's shown here is a generalized landscape, generalized riverscape in the Pacific Northwest. And what you're seeing is different parts of the landscape have different disturbance regimes in those parts of the landscape that dominate those features. So where you are in the watershed matters. And the types of disturbance regimes that would have been present there and continue to be present there, vary by where you are, again, in the landscape. And as one's thinking about natural disturbance regimes, part of that is that disturbance event, but it's followed by a period of renewal, which is a process that ecosystems require for maintaining their long-term productivity and integrity. And so a lot of times talking about minimizing this risk and managing towards natural disturbance regimes also allows or also requires time to pass to allow for the recovery of the systems. This figure here is to try to capture what's happening in watersheds where you have habitat quality changing over time. And so what you're looking at here would be 3 different time frames of the same watersheds, but the habitat quality in those locations is changing over time. So for example, if you look at the top watershed in time frame 1, it's dark orange, and that's considered high productivity. In time 2, it's going to low. In time 3, it's going to what would be considered moderate productivity. And so what you're seeing here is habitats changing over time and their quality of their habitat as disturbance is naturally occurring on the landscape. And now in our case, essentially in our modern world, we also have the human footprint on the landscape as well that needs to be taken into account. And so what you're seeing here is habitats nested within habitats. So within one of those watersheds, you're having different types of tributaries that have different quality of habitats as well, and different distributions of juvenile and adult fishes that have different levels of productivity that are essentially blinking on and off over time, as shown here. So essentially, if you were to take one of those watersheds and you blow it out into that bubble on the upper right, and then you take that bubble and you look at how that's changing over time down towards the bottom, you see that certain parts are more dominant at certain times than others. And let's look at some data that has shown what this has looked like. So This is an example of the catch history of 3 major fishing areas within Bristol Bay, Alaska for sockeye salmon. And what you're looking at here is catch in the millions of fishes in those 3 different areas, as shown by gray bars, white bars, and striped bars. And so a quote from this paper reads, "If managers in earlier times had decided to focus management on the most productive runs at the time and had neglected the less productive runs, the biocomplexity that later proved important could have been lost." And that's important to note, because if you see the most productive run from 1890 through 1970 is not the most productive run from 1970 on. And as we're making management decisions across the landscape and thinking about how habitat quality changes over time, what we're suggesting is that we should be managing for processes and not selecting one taxon or species or watershed area over another. Rather, we should be managing to minimize risk as best we can across the landscape. So the take-home messages here are that aquatic riparian ecosystems are dynamic and change over both space and time. Conservation plans that encourage a mosaic of habitat conditions essentially allows for like this habitat template or the play, the stage for the biocomplexity to play out over time. And it supports this portfolio concept of a population, community, habitat, landscape, and ecosystem diversity. So essentially, if you provide that stage, then the biological complexity can play out. Natural disturbance regimes can be recognized for their long-term management strategy in aquatic riparian ecosystems and their importance that they have in initiating change within the landscapes. And we can work to identify the processes that underlie the regionally relevant natural disturbance regimes to help guide management decisions across the landscape. And with that, I'll take any questions.
All right, thank you, Brooke. So we have plenty of time for questions here at the end, so please type any questions that you have either in the chat box or in the question box, and we'll ask those to the speakers. So the first question I have is for Chris, and the question is, how do you define prolonged drought?
How do I define prolonged drought? I guess I would look at it kind of in terms of response. So if you look at those hydrographs, I think I used that term in reference to groundwater levels. There was a period starting in 2014, going through 2015, where the precipitation around that one well was below normal. So I think the key bit is that it's not just seasonal drought, which is a climatological feature of the Pacific Northwest.
Okay, thank you. So any other questions, go ahead and type them in. In the meantime, we've got all the contact information for each of the speakers up on the screen. So if you have any specific questions that you'd like to follow up with them, you can do so. Also, if you would like to request copies of the presentations, you can contact Britt Parker and she'll be able to help you out with that. And again, just another reminder to join us for the next webinar on August 26th. So we still have a few more minutes for questions. If anybody has questions, go ahead and type them in. Okay, I have another question here. Is there a year in recent history that has exhibited a similar temperature and precipitation pattern? Perhaps maybe that's a John question or maybe a Chris question.
Yeah, I can't, and there are certainly methods where people look for analog years. And so the pattern that we've seen this year with, and again, how do we define year? I don't know, but at least in terms of spring, warm and dry spring, we've seen years like that before. I think I'm not sure, you know, we're not at the level of 2015, I would say. 2015, we had a pretty incredible drought. Snow was off the mountains very, very early. We don't have that sort of pattern this year, but I don't think that the sort of conditions we have this year are sort of completely dissimilar to what we've seen earlier. I just don't have one in mind. And I don't know if Troy has any ideas.
Yeah, I don't have any specific analog years right off the top of my head that I would point to.
Okay, well, we'll move on to the next question. John, this one's again for you. The question is, you mentioned El Nino pushes the jet stream south, but showed a figure regarding the western ridge blocking patterns that seems to show the jet stream north. Could you clarify?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think the subtropical jet stream has been further south. So we have seen this polar branch in the jet stream being shifted a bit north this year. So when talking about the jet stream, we probably have to clarify which one we're talking about. And usually what we see is the subtropical jet stream being pushed a bit further south. And this blocking pattern has been quite interesting and unusual, really changing sort of where precipitation falls across, you know, all the way from Alaska all the way down to California. And we just happen to be basically, you know, just downstream of the sort of the main sort of block. And so you know, Western Oregon, Western Washington, British Columbia, Southeastern Alaska basically have been, you know, not necessarily shut out, but not necessarily receiving the amount of, or the frequency of precipitation that we typically would.
Okay, we've got a few more questions here. Let's see, here's a question. How do we begin preparing now for non-linear impacts of climate change on our water systems across the Northwest? Is there a speaker who would like to comment on that question?
This is Chris. I mean, that's a big question. Yeah, I guess I'm not really sure. It's going to vary a lot depending on the type of supply. If you're a reservoir operator, you're getting your water from a reservoir. That's depending on snow melt. That's going to be very different than if you're using a small domestic well in bedrock geology, of the desert.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions here. I'll try to fit them in. A question for Chris again. Can you talk a little bit about whether some streams with low flow in one year are more likely to have lower flows again the following year?
We looked at that persistence, and there's not a really strong signal. You certainly would expect that if the river or stream is getting groundwater from a aquifer that doesn't really have much of a seasonal kind of fluctuation, but it's responding more to what we were talking about before, like persistent drought. So there can kind of be some memory in the system that way, but it's pretty subtle.
Thank you. Next question is, how likely is it that some parts of the Pacific Northwest will enter into extreme drought if there's drier than normal conditions in July? Perhaps that's for Troy.
Yeah, that it really depends on the impacts that are observed and what. Yeah, but I think right now, what do we have? D1 and maybe a little bit of D2. I can't remember what the map was showing. But, you know, it just depends. You know, if you look at the outlook for July, I think we have that favoring below normal precipitation, above normal temperatures, and some of the maps that John has already showed. Yeah, I just think of, you know, to what are those extremes? How much below normal precipitation, or how much above normal temperature, and you know, what do those impacts look like? That's going to determine whether, you know, we up the severity of the drought. And I can't really say what that's going to look like at this point.
I think there were just two more questions. A follow-on question to John's response about the jet streams. What happens when the jet streams collapse?
Collapse might mean that they merge together to form sort of a single jet. And that happens certainly across the sort of west of the date line. We usually have a sort of single jet, and there's often this sort of, you know, split sort of jet pattern that we see, where the jet ends up getting weaker. So when the jet stream is really, really strong, you know, you have a really strong, usually you have a pretty strong zonal flow. And, you know, I think that happens more often than not during El Nino. But this is, you know, when we're talking about really, really strong jets, we're usually talking about midwinter. This time of the year, the jet stream usually is weaker. It moves northward, and it also, you know, sort of moves off and weakens as it approaches the Pacific.
All right, thank you, everybody. We're here at the top of the hour. There's another question that was rather specific that we'll try to connect directly with the speakers to answer that question about additional instrumentation on the west side Olympic watersheds. Again, thanks everybody for joining us today. A recording of this webinar will be available on drought.gov later this week. And again, if you'd like the presentations, you can contact Britt Parker. And we hope to see you next time on August 26th. Thanks, everybody.